it was so unfamiliar and new, and there were very few resources or curriculum providers. These days, now, there are so many homeschool curricular options that it's almost overwhelming for families.
My name is Jared Julia, and welcome to The Cave, your source for information on how to combat woke in our school system. Today's guest is Trish Hutchins, a veteran homeschooling mom from Maine. Trish has homeschooled her sons from kindergarten through high school, and both boys are now in college. Trish is also on the Homeschoolers of Maine Board of Directors, and she joins us now. All right. Well, thank you so much, Trish, for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to huddle with me in the cave. But I just wanted you. I guess we could just start with the organization in Maine that encourages homeschooling.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to chat with you about homeschooling. It is a hot button topic in the state of Maine, as it is across the nation, and it's a very popular thing to talk about these days. A lot of families are interested in hearing more, and there are a lot of families who by this time have a great deal of experience homeschooling. So there's a lot of support out there for people who have questions or are wondering about the ins and outs of homeschooling. My name is Trish Hutchins. I am a regional representative with Homeschoolers of Maine. Homeschoolers of Maine was established in the state of Maine decades ago by Ed and Kathy Green, and they are still involved in the organization, but the organization has grown significantly since then. There are a number of people who work and volunteer with Homeschoolers of Maine all across the state. So there are supportive veteran homeschool parents and teachers and administrators who are available to answer questions regardless of where you live in the state. The mission of Homeschoolers of Maine is to preserve, protect, and promote homeschooling in the state of Maine. And by promote, what we mean is making sure that families know there are resources there to help them with the things they need to accomplish and the tasks they need to accomplish, and that homeschooling is for everyone in the sense that you don't have to be from a certain demographic to homeschool your kids. You don't need to have a certain social economic status to homeschool your kids. Children with IEPs or other learning difficulties in school often thrive in homeschooling, as well as accelerated students. And as we know, many of our students may be combinations of those things. So we find that there's a wide variety of homeschoolers in the state of Maine across all of our demographics, and everyone is represented within the homeschooling community. So we do encourage people to reach out to Homeschoolers of Maine with any questions they may have about just getting started, or maybe it's someone who's already started and has hit a roadblock of some sort, or who could just use some encouragement or an answer to a specific practical question.
Right, right. Now, it seems like homeschooling is a lot more popular now than it was because years ago, when I was growing up, I'm older. I went to high school in the early '80s and college in the late '80s, and it seems like back then homeschooling was pretty unusual. It was a few people that were doing it, but when I was raising my kids more recently, it seems like it's very, very prevalent now. What is driving that increase?
Sure, that's a great question. There are manifold reasons why families may choose to homeschool. As compared to the 80s and 90s, what you were mentioning, I think that it was so unfamiliar and new, and there were very few resources or curriculum providers that
Mm.
would send curricula directly to your door that's ready to use by a parent. So these days, now, there are so many homeschool curricular options that it's almost overwhelming for families. They have the opposite problem of trying to choose from hundreds of curriculum providers, and that difference has made it easier for families who maybe weren't considering homeschooling or don't have an educational background to say, actually, I can do this because this is written for me by experts in their field who have prepared a curriculum for me, and I can just open it and use it with my kids today. So that's a big general contributor to making it easier for all of us to homeschool. Another reason for choosing to homeschool is, I think, as economies change and as political parties and their preferences for education change in our states, we can't always rely on the public school to have a consistent educational experience for our kids. And
Hmm.
obviously, the biggest example of this was when COVID hit, which we can't blame the government for, we can't necessarily blame the economy for, but it did impact those things. We had a lot of families just kind of forced into homeschooling at that time, and a lot of families who proactively chose to homeschool at that time. It was kind of like a mass experiment where people had their children at home with them, and the parents were charged with overseeing their education. And a lot of parents realized, oh, I actually can oversee their education
Right.
myself.
Yeah. Well,
This is something within reach for me.
yeah, that's interesting because I do think that the pandemic was a game changer in so many ways, but I think especially in education because this was the first time that education went from being in the classroom to being on a laptop in your kitchen, and you open up the laptop and you click on Zoom, and your kid attends class at the local public school that way. But for the first time, parents are actually hearing what these schools are actually teaching their kids, and that was one driver for a lot of parents that I've talked to for their decision to homeschool.
Yes. And we do have respect for a lot of the educators that are trying to work with our kids in the schools. Many of them are doing what they are being asked to do for our children in our communities. It's often an impossible task for a teacher to meet the individual needs of 15 or 20 plus students in a classroom. And then when we add on a lot of governmental regulations that take away the freedom of a teacher to decide how to tackle material or how to approach it, it becomes very stultified. So for families at home, as I mentioned, there's so many curricular options that having that personal freedom to decide this is what works best for our family and this actually meets the needs of my children in a way that may be more efficient, that may produce more beneficial academic outcomes for them, or it may address the needs that families want to tackle in their children's educational journey that aren't necessarily academic. Some of them more philosophical approaches or pedagogical approaches that are underlying all of our children's education. But I think a lot of parents are having their eyes open that there is no such thing as a neutral education. There is
Mm,
no such thing as sending a child to an educational institution, having it be perfectly bias free and neutral.
right.
That doesn't exist. So families being able to say, I'm actually empowered now to do what is best for my family as an individual is what is best for our community at large because we're raising these children who are confident and capable and they are academically prepared, but they're also in a real world environment during the day instead of an age segregated environment during the day. These things do trickle out into the community to make a stronger community, which is often paradoxical to people. Homeschoolers frequently get hit with the question of, aren't you supposed to be contributing to our community? You're
Right.
pulling away from everyone else. You're insular or you're judgmental by saying this isn't good enough for you. But really, homeschooling provides a real world experience, a multi age experience
Yep.
that does prepare kids for what's coming for them in the real world as far as starting families and being involved in civic organizations and going to work.
Yeah, and they can also get involved in the local extracurricular activities because we had a homeschool girl who was on the track team of our local high school, and the lead in our class play was a boy who was also homeschooled in our area. So, but I think another criticism of homeschooling that I find is that maybe it's not up to standards. How do you ensure that, or how can a parent ensure that educational standards are met for things like going to a trade school or later going to college?
Sure. There are requirements or standards for homeschoolers in the state of Maine. They are similar to requirements, broad requirements for students who are in more traditional school environments. Homeschoolers are required in the state of Maine to complete 175 days of academic content. There is flexibility here as far as what counts as a school day. It does not have to be only a Monday to Friday, and it can include summer days and holidays, those kinds of things. It can be evenings and weekends, but we do have to school for 175 days, which is the same requirement for students who are in traditional school environments. So in that case,
Hmm.
there is no difference. We also are required to meet qualifications for the core subjects, English and language arts, math, science, and social studies. In addition, those extra subjects like physical education and health, fine arts, library skills is on the list, as well as a year of Maine studies or Maine studies that is addressed during one school year. It doesn't have to take the whole school year, but during
Hmm.
one school year, you have to address Maine studies as well as computer proficiency. So that's a broad spectrum of subjects that all homeschoolers are required to have documentation as far as how they are meeting those standards. So it varies from state to state what the legislation requires of homeschool families, and some
Right.
states are exceedingly strict and some are very comparatively flexible. Maine is fairly flexible, but it did take a lot of work on behalf of homeschoolers of Maine and other people on the legislative committee who were willing to hash out what is it that's best for families that produces the best outcomes. And our current legislation is what has been landed on. And it does take continuing monitoring of upcoming bills in the legislative session that may affect homeschooling. Sometimes people know it will affect homeschooling. Sometimes they don't know that it will affect homeschooling, but Homeschoolers of Maine is always on the lookout for upcoming bills that may impact homeschooling and will constantly bring up the points of, well, you're not allowed actually to ask for this information, or you're not allowed to require this information, and you're not allowed to, for example, visit homeschoolers' homes and require that they show you their
Right.
paperwork. Those kinds of measures are often brought up by opponents of homeschoolers as helpful for homeschoolers, but Homeschoolers of Maine really doesn't consider those to be helpful measures. So we're always kind of hoping to work with those around us to say, this is what is working well for us, and this is what the legislation says, and we're just going to leave it at that.
Right. Right. Now, what do you say to any parent who says, I'd like to homeschool, but I don't have the time. I have a very busy life and I don't think I can make the time commitment for this.
It's a good question. Homeschooling is for everyone in the sense that there is no group of people or demographic of people that homeschooling will not work for. And as a matter of fact, minority groups and families from lower social economic statuses are the largest driver of growth currently in the homeschool community nationwide. A lot of these families find that their local school systems are unable to meet the needs for their families and they are turning to homeschooling. And so homeschooling is for everyone in that sense. There is no group of
Mhm.
people that is not
Right.
finding success in the field of homeschooling, but it does take some time. Someone needs to oversee the education of the child if they are homeschooled. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be mom, it doesn't have to be dad. A lot of families are in two income families. There are single mothers and single fathers. There are children who are in unconventional family units. So it doesn't have to be the primary parent who is directly in charge of the educational delivery,
Mhm.
but the parent is responsible for making sure the child is receiving their education. And that could be through grandma or grandpa, a neighbor, a homeschooling pod or class that's closest to them, a
Mhm.
tutoring group, online classes. Those are ways that families who are busy can still provide an education without being a person that's sitting at a desk or a table the way we would picture a teacher being present in a classroom for several hours a day. There are other ways to achieve these goals.
Right, right. Okay, interesting. Now you talk about how it varies from state to state, the legislation. Is there upcoming legislation being considered in Augusta? And is there upcoming legislation maybe federally that homeschoolers might be concerned about or interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. A recent example of legislation that did pass was lowering the compulsory school age in Maine from 7 to 6.
Okay.
It used to be that you were responsible for providing an assessment of your homeschool year if your child was 7 or above up to the age of 17. And within the past several years, that has been lowered to 6. And that does also include students who are in traditional school environments, but they lowered it by 1 year. And so that is an example of a change that affects all students in the state of Maine, including homeschoolers. And that piece of legislation is enacted. Another one that has been enacted that affects homeschoolers indirectly is the vaccine legislation that passed in September of 2021 or took effect in September of 2021 in the state of Maine. So students who want to access public school for full-time education or just one class or even an extracurricular, or in some cases, even sitting for an AP exam or an SAT exam in a public school classroom, now are required to show their vaccination record. This affected a lot of families who then decided to homeschool when it wasn't
Mm,
really on their radar before.
right,
And there's a large community of these families who are banding together and providing educational opportunities for their children because this is what is working best for them at the time. So, as we know, that was a contentious legal issue here in the state of Maine, and this is our current status as far as the legislation has passed and is in effect. Upcoming issues, the biggest one seems to be how we fund education and how that affects private school students and homeschool students. There's a lot of talk about educational savings accounts, or should the money that it takes to educate a child, however that metric is determined, say it takes, this is not the correct number, but say it takes $10,000 to educate a child for a year according to the
right.
state or the federal government. Should that $10,000 follow the student wherever the student goes? Private school, Christian school, a religious school, homeschool, a hybrid model where the student is in some kind of classroom environment 2 or 3 days a week and home the other time, charter schools, or does all that money, as has been typical for a long time, go directly to the public school?
Right.
And then if students' families choose to send them to private school, they have to pay for that themselves. So this is a nationwide issue. Many states and an increasing number of them are incorporating educational savings accounts where the family receives a certain amount of funding or a voucher that they are allowed to use toward the educational model of their choice. And there is talk of this happening in the state of Maine.
Oh, that's interesting because it's happened already in a lot of other states and other places. In New York City, for example, the ESA program hasn't gone very well, but that's because people say that it's more of a top-down system where they determine where the money will follow the student. But in a lot of these other states where it's much more free and it's pretty much wherever the student goes, the money goes, they're actually finding that there's this unintended consequence, and that is that the local public school, which people were saying would fail or would not perform as well, those are actually performing better when they stop when the public school has to compete for funds. It actually improves, which no one anticipated, no one on either side anticipated, and it's kind of inconvenient information for a lot of these teachers unions to admit to. But there's more and more data coming back from these states that have already done the ESAs. So,
Yes, it's very difficult for everyone, whether we're talking about education or something else, to disrupt the status quo, something that's been in place for a really long time. And whether we like it or not, education is a big business in this country.
mm,
There are a lot of people who are providing resources and textbooks and classroom furniture and office furniture and copiers and all of these things to public schools and private schools. It's a big money business. It takes
right,
a lot of money to keep it going. And when a lot of people opt out of it, the expenses don't necessarily decrease for a public school. They feel like we still have to maintain all of this. And it causes people to really look at, where is the money going? Is it going to directly to the education of the kids? Or is there a lot of money that's being spent on supplemental materials or things that maybe could be looked at differently now that we have fewer students in the public school because they're being homeschooled? And it's really a driver of change in that way, which, as we know, is painful for a lot of people to accept that things have to change. But this is the reality that we're in, that a lot of families are saying this model, that's traditional education, is not meeting the needs of our children in the best way possible. We found a different way and we're going to take it, and people are going to have to adjust. And what we're going to see growing up around that is a lot of big business around homeschooling. There
mm,
already are many businesses around homeschooling, but we're seeing a particular boom in things like micro schools or cottage schools or hybrid schools that want homeschoolers to come for a day or two in a week and then let the parents homeschool the rest of the days. And it's kind of a happy medium for these groups. But a lot of these groups are also charging a lot of tuition. They're making money off of this new
right.
change, which is what people do. So
Yeah.
these are things that we are observing. There are going to be pros and cons to educational savings accounts. The pros obviously are that people are recognizing homeschooling as a valid educational delivery
Right.
mechanism, which is great. We like that. It also provides funding for families that may struggle to provide the educational materials for their kids. We all know public schools provide things like speech therapy or other behavioral therapies or one-on-one classes for kids with particular special needs that aren't automatically met outside of the public school system. And these funds can be used to access some of those appointments and therapies that kids need. So these are all benefits
Hmm.
to an educational savings account. The drawbacks that can come are that this money is funneled to us through the government. It is given to us, kind of granted to us by the government, and this always comes with strings attached.
Sure.
So it may not immediately come through the front door with strings attached, or they may be very few, or they may be strings that we're comfortable accepting.
Hmm.
But as things change and as governors come and go, and as state representatives come and go, and are even at the nationwide level, changes within the Department of Education come and go, these things will affect the strings they attach to that money that they allow us to have.
Right.
And it is possible that they will say, these are the things you're allowed to buy. These are the curricula you're allowed to use. You are not allowed to buy these or use these other things, or we take the money away again. And this can be a huge problem for the right to educate our children in the way that we want to educate our children.
Right.
So it is Homeschoolers of Maine's stance at this time that we need to be exceedingly cautious about accepting funding from the government. Traditionally, homeschooling has been funded by the family. And if there is that financial buy-in for the family, then there's a certain commitment to it. And there's also no infringement on the freedom or the rights of the parent, which can come into play with educational savings accounts. California is a classic example of saying you're not allowed to use curricula from traditional Christian homeschool providers such as
Mm.
Apologia or ABECA, where they'll say that actually doesn't count. So if you administered biology, say, through an Apologia textbook and you try to go to college in our University of California system, we will not recognize that you have ever had biology. It's like it never
Oh,
was, and
wow.
we'll make you take it again as a
Yeah.
remedial course.
Mm.
So those strings came in with educational funding money. So
Hmm.
we need to be very careful and cautious about proposed legislation about this in the state of Maine.
Right, right. Okay. Now, what if a parent comes to you and says, "Okay, I want to homeschool, but I have no idea what to do." What's the first thing you guys do?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fairly easy to begin homeschooling in the state of Maine. I call these two requirements bookends to your year at the beginning of your homeschooling year, which for many people is late August, September, traditional school year beginning. It doesn't have to be. And for students who have started school in the public school or private school and are being withdrawn, it could be at any point in the academic year that you're beginning your homeschool year. You may move in the middle of a year. That's okay. Within 10 days of beginning to homeschool, whether it's in September or sometime during the year, we are required to file what's called a notice of intent to homeschool. We
Okay.
send it to the Department of Education in Augusta or to our local superintendent of schools in our local school district. And it's simply a notification. It is not a permission slip. It is not a request for, would you please allow us to homeschool? We know we're allowed to homeschool by law in the state of Maine. So this is simply a notification. It is giving the student's name and age, and it is saying, we were notifying you that we will be homeschooling this student for this academic year. So you are required by law to send in that piece of paper. Then you commence to homeschool. Homeschoolers of Maine does have curricular counseling. So if you really, if you're like, I want to start homeschooling tomorrow, or we had some kind of incident or family emergency and my child was in school yesterday, but today we need to do something different, we can help you today. If for parents who are planning ahead, we can help you set up a long-term plan for the resources that you could use that will meet your child's learning style. So there is free curricular counseling through Homeschoolers of Maine for anyone looking for specific advice on that. And then
Hmm.
you begin to homeschool. At the end of the year, we are required to either submit standardized test scores for our children, which can sound scary to do, but there are no guidelines around what the test scores must show. You just need to submit the test scores. So, for example, if we have a third grader and they've taken a standardized test, you just send in the results. No one is allowed to say to you, oh, well, I see they're reading at a third grade level, but their math was at second grade level. What's up with that? No one is allowed to say that to you. The legislation simply says submit the standardized test results. There are no requirements for what the test must show.
Mm.
So that can take pressure off. So we are required either to send those standardized test scores or to have samples of our students' work looked over by a certified Maine teacher. That certified Maine teacher will look at samples from the year and say, oh, I can see you've made progress in math. I can see you've made progress in reading. Here's your reading list. That's good. I can see you tackled these subjects in science. That's good. They will give a letter to you and you will send that letter to the Department of Education or your local superintendent, and the teacher will sign that. A lot of us know certified teachers, and you can ask a certified teacher who you know to do that letter for you. If you
Mhm.
are a certified teacher in the state of Maine, you may sign your own letter. Or if there's a family member of yours who is a certified teacher in the state of Maine, they may sign your letter.
Mhm.
But Homeschoolers of Maine also keeps certified teachers on staff. So we
Oh,
have a team of certified teachers on staff, and you can send in samples. There's multiple ways to do it. You can drop it off physically at the home office in Hope, Maine. You can send it by mail. You can fill it out digitally online and send it via email or a Google Drive link. You can meet with other homeschool families in what we call a group portfolio review, where you bring samples of your students' work and you meet other families from your local area who are doing the same. You meet a certified teacher and you meet a representative of Homeschoolers of Maine so you can ask questions in person and maybe make some local homeschool connections. So there are a lot of ways to meet that requirement.
okay. Well, great. So how do people get more information on homeschoolers of Maine?
Sure, there is a website for Homeschoolers of Maine. It's homeschoolersofmaine.org. It's a large website. There are tons of links. There are articles on there that you can click on for statistics about the success of homeschooling academically, as far as academic performance compared to privately schooled or publicly schooled kids. This data consistently shows that homeschoolers outperform these children on standardized tests and other metrics. This
Mm.
is not the only reason to homeschool in order to kind of outdo everyone else on standardized testing, but it does provide some measure of comfort that it is legitimate and it does work as far as meeting academic needs. But
Hmm.
we know there are many other reasons for homeschooling. But a lot of these rationales can be helpful for families who are considering it or who may have someone in their lives who are questioning their decision to homeschool. These statistics can be comforting and soothing. Those can be found on the website. You can also find a link to regional contacts. So if, and some, you can just Google this if you like. You can
Right.
Google Homeschoolers of Maine regional representatives or contact us, and it will come up with a list of people from every county in the state of Maine that you can call or email with questions. So I do encourage anyone who has questions to look at the website. And if you're not finding what you want, then go ahead and just go to contact us and give someone a call or send an email, and someone will get back to you about your particular situation.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Trish, for joining us. This was very informative, and yeah. Thanks so much.
Well, I appreciate the invite and I was happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us here on The Cave. For more information on homeschoolers of Maine, look at the links on the screen. And thank you so much for joining us. Well, if you like what you saw, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to smack that bell.